Welcome to my first special episode. Woohoo! Since it is election day today in the US, or it is as of the time of releasing, I decided to make a brief video going over the history of voting in the US and some of its origins as well. It's not exhaustive, but it gives a decent overview of the major sort of landmarks that you should probably know about to some degree. Our story begins all the way back in ancient Greece, where democratic ideals were just starting to take root. It wasn't an overnight transition by any means. They didn't just wake up, overthrow the king, and start a democracy. It was a gradual development, and really that's the story of progress. It's not always quick, sometimes it goes backwards a little, but it always moves along, one step at a time. The Greek city-states, like most ancient civilizations, were monarchies. Many of these kings had councils of wealthy, influential aristocrats, your, your ancient Jeff Bezos, if you will, who advised them, basically. And over time, these councils realized, very important fact, they were already making a lot of the decisions. They didn't need the king. So some city-states moved towards oligarchy, where a small group of elite citizens run the affairs of state. The key point here is that they are elite. In this time period, there was no middle class. You were essentially, to speak generally, either rich or impoverished. Where democracy came was with the origins of the middle class. In Greece, a lot of this relied on the advent of coin money. Once you have coin money, suddenly people are much more easily able to accumulate wealth. Now they can buy their own weapons. Now they can be part of the military without having to rely on the money of the upper classes. And suddenly you have a well-armed, independent populace. And what does that lead to? A much the origins of democracy and the creation of a new middle class, unseen until that point, really. Now, democracy at this time was direct. Everyone voted. Of course, by everyone, we mean all citizens. Um, there was plenty of inequality, but all the male, free citizens would eventually be able to vote. Women could not vote, slaves could not vote, but it was a start. Many of our modern American values originate at that time, um, much due especially to Pericles, one of the leaders at the height of Athens' power, their golden age, um, gave a speech praising Athenian democracy, where he said it should be the model for the world, that government service is good, that people have both rights and responsibilities, that public beauty is positive, and that public debate is a good thing. If you look at these, you can very clearly see them mirrored in our, not just in our Constitution, but just our culture in general. The system wouldn't last, however, though. Very little does. Athens would fall to Mr. Alex the Great around 338 BC, and wouldn't see democracy again for centuries. Another nation, though, would continue where Greece left off. Obviously, there was overlap, but that nation is, of course, Rome, which in many ways has had more influence on our modern society in America than Greece did. In different ways, of course. Rome began as a kingdom. Their history is long and complicated, but to try and keep this America-centered, as all too much of history is, I'm just gonna skim over a lot and say that in 509 BC, they overthrew their final king and formed the Roman Republic. They had a senate made up of the elite and two consuls who served as executives in one-year terms. Not gonna get into all the nuances of Roman government, but the key thing is it was the start of the idea of a republic, of electing a representative to vote for you instead of directly voting yourself. This origin of our system of representative democracy also led to all the ideas of checks and balances and the veto originated this time. Just in general, I mean, if you look at any government building, where should we take our architecture from? The Greeks and the Romans. Anyway, fast forward a couple thousand years to the 1700s. Merc time. Voting then was pretty much completely left to the states, and in general, only white men with property could vote. New Jersey, at this time, was a often overlooked exception where property-owning women were allowed to vote as well. Didn't last for too long, but, I mean, way to go, New Jersey. Gradually through the 1800s, the property requirement was dropped, and eventually in 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, guaranteeing the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This was a major landmark for most of the population, but for some it was tinged with disappointment. The abolition and women's movements had been closely aligned for a long time. Frederick Douglass, for instance, attended and spoke at the Seneca Falls Convention. But many women's right activists were disappointed at their exclusion from the amendment, and from then on out, the movements were pretty much separate. Women decided they could no longer rely on men to help them in their struggle. They would fight alone. The South, meanwhile, would immediately start finding ways to bar recently enfranchised black citizens from voting. After the failure of Reconstruction, there was a wave of literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and other restrictions that we now know as Jim Crow to ensure that only the white population would be able to vote. In addition, when this wasn't enough, terrorist groups like the KKK would intimidate, beat, kill, rob, burn the houses of those few African Americans who still tried to vote. These tactics worked. Over an 8-year period, two um, presidential election cycles, black voters in Louisiana dropped by 99% from 130,000 to 1,300. However, there was some progress made. The right for women had been advancing on a state-by-state basis for years, and in 1920 was extended nationwide by the 19th Amendment. In theory, everyone over the age of 21 could now vote, provided they weren't a minority in the South, or a prisoner, or someone that the Ku Klux Klan didn't like, which was basically everyone except for themselves. But it it was a major step forward. Jim Crow would surge during the 1960s, but in the end, the civil rights movement would win out in that regard, seeing the passage of the 24th Amendment, which made poll taxes illegal, and 1 year later, the Voting Rights Act, which made major strides in protecting, as you would assume from the name, the right to vote. Just 6 years later, the 26th Amendment would extend the vote to all citizens over the age of 18, provided, once again, those other factors. For instance, prisoners still even today often can't vote. Over the following decades, Congress would take steps to make voting more accessible for minority language speakers, the disabled, and just the general public overall, taking steps to make voter registration easier, provide more access to early voting, etc. In 2013, however, things began sliding backwards once more. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court struck down large portions of the Voting Rights Act in the case Shelby County v. Holder, a decision Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg compared to, quote, throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet, unquote. With the decision, many states would take advantage of this to place more barriers to voting, changing registration laws, limiting early voting, just limiting polling places, making it illegal for you to give water to someone in line to vote, just generally making it more difficult, especially for lower income people and minorities. Gerrymandering, always a problem, became even more extreme, of course, further limiting people, just limiting the power that your vote has. And then came the 2020 election. It was one of the highest turnout elections in US history, and also one of the most contentious and widespread accusations of fraud, and the losing side claiming that the election was stolen. To be crystal clear, it was not, as shown by multiple recounts, audits, and lawsuits all around the country. Eventually, these arguments would move from legal battles to physical ones. On January 6th, 2021, a mob attacked and entered the U.S. Capitol building, forcing Congress to evacuate and pause the certification of electoral votes, a largely symbolic affair. It didn't succeed in its aim, but it caused 4 people to die at the during the attack. 4 people died during the attack, and several Capitol police officers would later commit suicide. It was a dark day for American democracy and shows the dangers of the lies and extremism that fuel our modern politics on both sides. Which is why we, as the people, need to hold our politicians accountable for what they say, what they do, how they vote, the promises they make, and the promises they break. That's why we need to stay informed. We need to research the best candidate instead of just voting for the, if they have an R or a D next to their name. In the immortal words of Benjamin Franklin, our nation is a republic if you can keep it. Happy Election Day.